Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Redberryweo here, and welcome back to another quick Civil Air Patrol video. In today's video, we are talking about my personal experience with several different units and how they were run. So, if you have an additional experience that may be a little bit different, or like, for example, if you are active in a senior squadron, I personally don't have experience with that, so please feel free to share that in the comments down below. So we're going to start with the first unit that I was part of, which I was with for a couple of years. And so with that unit, it was primarily cadet run. So for the most part, as a new cadet in that unit, I had never really interacted with the senior members. I did very occasionally, especially when we did emergency services activities, but otherwise the cadets were running everything. So every week, the cadet staff, they would share the agenda right before the meeting, like the day before. They would send out an email to everyone saying, hey everyone, here's the UOD or the uniform of the day. Here are the different lessons and who's teaching them. And then the next day we would have our meeting and we would just go from there. So it was pretty straightforward. Most lessons were taught by cadets. Occasionally it was taught by senior members, like mainly emergency services, because at the time we had two people who were EMS in our unit, and so they taught some of their skills. And then one of them was even a first aid trainer, so we got to do first aid training at a reduced cost because he was able to use the materials from his instruction and just make it so that we only had to pay the bare minimum in order for it to cover any materials we needed. So like the CPR mask and a couple of other small things that we were able to take home with us. With that unit, in terms of its composition, when I first joined, I think we had a pretty active cadet corps of 30 cadets or so, and then a lot of them started graduating or moving away, and we weren't very active with recruiting people and getting them really invested in the program. And so later on, like when I was a more senior cadet, we only really had 4 cadets actively attending meetings versus like 20. So there was a drastic shift in that while the senior cadets were still running the squadron over time, there was still very limited senior member support. And so we had a difficult time onboarding, getting cadets through promotions. Like in one of my last videos, I talked about the Quality Cadet Unit Award, and I can link it up here. But essentially, you're supposed to try to get your cadets to complete their first achievement within 8 weeks. There was one cadet who we had as an airman first class. No, he was like a cadet airman for maybe like 2 years. And then he promoted to senior airman and was sat at it for like another year or two and then left. I was like, what? You're not even going to promote? What I would say to that is, if you do experience a cadet who's not promoting, you would always talk to them about how the grade on their collar is their resume and shows how much experience they have, and if it misaligns between how much they know and understand and experience versus what people think they might have, then it can give mixed messages. And you also want to show your motivation by modeling positive behaviors to junior cadets. But that cadet just did not want to promote. So there were also a couple of challenges with the unit getting involved with outside of squadron activities. Like the cadets who would come to the meetings, they would just come to meetings. They didn't necessarily go to outside of unit activities like anything at the group level or the wing level. Part of that was that since we were just cadets, we didn't really hear anything from the senior members outside of the squadron. And part of that was because we didn't officially have wing email addresses at that point. That was established a little bit later on. So if I wanted to send a senior member to another unit, I would have needed their contact information. And I think you could, like at the time, you could still go into e-services and then check the boxes for people in your unit. And I think you can also look up people's email addresses in another way. But it was very convoluted in order to find contact information for others, and you would need to know who they were before contacting them. And now that it's completely different, like internet and wing email addresses being way more advanced than it was like when I initially joined, that's definitely helped. Like if someone says, hey, you need to contact Captain Smith, then at least I could look up Smith and it pulls up all of the email addresses for anyone with the name Smith in my wing in the current system. So it's very useful in that way. But anyway, Moving on to another unit that I had experience with, it was more of a balance between cadet run and senior member run with that unit, and it was interesting because they had very limited senior cadets. And when I was helping and supporting them, I was cadet lieutenant colonel, and I had already served as a cadet commander at my previous unit, so I wanted to do what I could to help and just serve as a mentor and a deputy to that cadet commander. And the cadet commander was a cadet first lieutenant who had very limited experience with long-term planning, talking about mission, vision, command intent with the unit, and just kind of looked at the schedule as a week-to-week thing. And we tried to instill a process of looking at the long-term calendar of like, what do we need to accomplish each month, and then scheduling. And the senior members didn't really like how the cadet command staff was trying to do planning during the meetings, but then the cadet commander didn't really want to meet outside of meetings, so it was a little bit challenging to try to bring everyone together to just plan. And so it was an interesting experience. It was actually a much larger unit than my previous one. I think it had something like 40 cadets actively attending meetings, maybe even 50. And so it was a lot of cadets coming to the meetings, doing PT and ES and leadership, and they were meeting at an armory, which was different from the other location that I was meeting at, which was previously a school. And so it was interesting to see the large drill hall, basically, when we would go every week versus like just having a bunch of classrooms. And when we would run those meetings, it was mostly cadets trying to figure out what the schedule was going to be week to week and then sending that out. So that stayed consistent between the two units I went to. And I tried to instill more long-term planning, like both when I was at my previous unit and that unit. We looked at long-term planning and tried to instill a plan. With the smaller unit, it was more difficult because I was the main senior cadet who was actively involved. And so I ended up having to teach a lot of the classes, coming up with the lesson plans, and facilitating them at meetings. So it was a little bit different because at the larger unit had way more people to delegate to, and we still wanted to provide leadership opportunities for junior cadets to teach classes and get involved. So it was a bit different in that we had classes where we would do small breakout sessions. And so let's say we're teaching a leadership class and we're talking about a concept like giving feedback. In that feedback class with 40 people in it, we might break them off into four different groups of 10, or maybe even 5 groups of 8. And we would just split them off evenly so that they could have small group discussions that would talk about a set of questions set forward by whoever was instructing the class. And then we would all come back together, and then each group would have a representative talking about what their team discussed or any recommendations. And anything that the instructor was asking for, a person leading the team would present. And something that unit did much better was doing fundraising events, especially with doing parking events, which is something that they very frequently did. So that was a benefit to having so many people in the unit, is that if one person wasn't available, everything wouldn't fall through the cracks. There would be another person who could teach, or there could be a backup lesson. Like sometimes they had pocket classes where the first sergeant would have a set of pocket classes, or like the flight commanders and the flight sergeants would have something put together just in case something did not happen. Then it would still meet the contact hours that are listed out in CAP Regulation 60-1 to make sure that the meeting was doing what it needed to. And drill and ceremonies was very different too, because we would break off into a ton of different little groups of, like, they had many flights versus just having one, which was very different. And we would go outside and we would use the little spot in the parking lot that was fenced off, and we would also use a drill hall to do stuff as well. So that was how it was run. It was it was mainly cadet run, but the senior members were actively involved, in which they were teaching a little bit, some classes, about the same percentage of classes, and they were also helping with logistics. Like there was one senior member especially involved with distributing uniform items and making sure everyone had what they needed. With the smaller unit, it was sometimes a little bit more difficult to obtain uniform items, but they did something really cool where every achievement you would receive the certificate printed off and it was signed by the squadron commander. When I got to the bigger unit, there wasn't as much recognition per achievement for cadets unless it was a milestone, partially because there were just so many cadets promoting that you couldn't spend the entire meeting doing promotions. You just kind of had to go through everyone and say, hey, these cadets achieved the first achievement. Yay! The next experience that I had with units was another small unit, and it was very interesting because they had a couple of senior members, and the senior members were super duper active. And they were very nice, they were very experienced, especially in emergency services, and that's when I started getting most of my quals knocked off for my emergency services. So even though I had been in CAP, like, I think it was 7 years at that point, I hadn't actually completed GTM 3 or UDF, and GTM 3 is ground team member level 3, which is like the lowest level, and UDF is urban direction finding. So I didn't actually complete those until I got to that unit where I was like, yeah, I've been a trainee since 2010, and they're all like, you want to get signed off on those things? And I was like, yeah, I have the experience and I know these different things, but I've just never been signed off because when I was in the other units, they didn't have people signing off as actively as I thought they would. And when we did training exercises, I got signed off for a very select few things, but not everything in terms of F&P. So it was really cool. In the smaller unit, the senior members there kind of championed me through it and were like, yeah, you can do it, and we're gonna get you through it. So that was really cool. And we also, we looked into the van and we did a bunch with maintenance and seeing how that worked, and it was so cool seeing some of the younger cadets who had never seen the inside of an engine before. That was pretty cool, lifting up the hood of the van and being like, look how much stuff is in there, and they're like, whoa. We got to meet at an airport on some weeks, and we got to meet at a school on other weeks, depending on what week we flipped between those. And when we were meeting at the airport, we would do drill and ceremonies in the parking spots while it was still light out, so that if planes were coming in at night, then we would not be in the way. We would do it early and then get it over with and go inside. And when we did character development, the squadron commander was really active with hosting those conversations and having discussions with the cadets. It was really cool to see. So I really enjoyed that experience with the smaller unit because I got to know others a little bit better than I did with that larger unit before, and I got to teach a bunch of classes and try to help and support the unit where I could. It was interesting that each squadron had its own traditions. With the larger unit, they would say the cadet oath at the very end of the meeting and get super hyped about it. And then with the other, with the next unit, the small unit, I guess I'll call it the second small unit. The second small unit, they did the Pledge of Allegiance and the Cadet Oath and the Safety Pledge at the beginning of the meeting during formation, and they wore their covers inside, which we shouldn't have been doing, and I mentioned it, and they were like, well, we're going to continue doing it anyway because that's our tradition. And I was like, okay, cool. And so it was just a fun time, and I really enjoyed being with them for the time that I was there and just helping support them as best I could. The agenda every week was, from what I understand with that smaller unit, I wasn't as actively involved with planning. I'm pretty sure it was the senior members were putting it together and sending it to the cadets, and then the cadets would just kind of execute it. And a lot of times the senior members were teaching classes. There were some classes taught by experienced cadets, but it was always taught by someone who was super experienced. And I think it would have been good to see a little bit more of the junior cadets leading things, letting them lead drill or lead classes so that they would get more experience. But I think they had their own flow of how they ran things. And I wasn't there long enough to really, instill long-term changes, but I gave a little recommendation here and there to just be like, hey, this is something I'm observing. And they'd be like, okay, thanks for letting us know. And I would be like, here's a quick recommendation. They'd be like, okay, we'll keep that in mind. So I did greatly enjoy being in that unit. And then the next unit I took part in supporting was another large unit, and it was almost entirely senior member run. And so with the senior member run squadron, it was the CDC putting together the agenda every week, and that was being sent out by the squadron commander to the entire unit. And then when we would go to the meeting, the first sergeant at the meeting would tell everyone, here's where everyone needs to go. And like cadets who are doing testing, go over here. Cadets who are doing this class, go to the back room. And the cadets going to this class, go over to that classroom. And everyone would kind of disperse during each block of the meeting depending on what they were doing. And so like sometimes there would be like a cadet staff meeting happening during the meeting in one area, and then other cadets, they would be doing like a leadership class. Like if they were phase 1, phase 2 cadets, then they'd be doing that with one of the cadet programs officers. There was also a Great Start Academy that was happening, and that was very actively involved with a couple of senior cadets, or well, like at least one senior cadet and a couple of cadets in training, with a senior member head who was helping lead that. And mainly the cadets were planning each week and working with the senior member. Then there was also like drill testing was a very interesting process where normally one senior member was in charge of that. So with that unit, one of the challenges was that there were times where cadets did not have the opportunity to fail. And so one of my thoughts actively when I was serving in that squadron was that I wanted to see the cadets challenged more, to be told, okay, here's a leadership challenge and here, go ahead, execute it and do what you need to. And there were a couple of times where a cadet would want to do something, they would propose it, and they just kept getting shut down because it didn't meet the normal pattern for meetings, or it didn't meet the requirements for the activity, and they would receive 3 rounds of feedback and they would just be like, well, I don't want to plan this anymore because it seems like progress isn't being made, so I'm just going to stop trying. And I wish that the cadets were given just more opportunities to try new things and just go for it. Like as an example, there was a time that the like feedback sessions in a large unit, doing feedback sessions once per phase and making sure the supervisor cadet and then the junior cadet get a chance to meet with the senior member sitting in, maybe 2 senior cadets who are in charge of that one cadet sitting in and giving feedback, is very difficult to do with a large unit that sees 80 cadets in person every week. That's very difficult. And so that squadron's solution for that was to do something called a feedback blitz, where they did all the feedback at one meeting a year. And while that works as a technique, that is one approach, my approach would have been to spread out the feedback over the year. Because doing all of them, doing like 50, 60 feedback sessions in one meeting, you got to keep track of all the forms, you got to keep all of the cadets engaged, and so it makes it very tricky to do hands-on, like doing a lesson here and then pulling cadets out and then putting them back in. And it was very challenging to run that kind of meeting. And so some approaches that could be taken instead of that, so here are some alternatives: doing feedback sessions virtually. I've been in units where they do them in person and they do them virtually. Yes, in person you get to see more nonverbal cues of someone using their hands or like facial expressions. Like if they don't have their camera on, it's even harder. So like you can do them virtually, you can also do them in person. Sometimes units would schedule them ahead of the meeting. Like if the meeting starts at 6:30, doing the feedback session from 6 to 6:15, and then doing one from 6:15 to 6:30. And then having a list of all the cadets and prioritizing, here's the one that's closest to their next phase, and here's their date of eligibility to promote into that next phase, and then just listing off everyone, and then just going through every week, knocking out 2. Knocking out 3 or 4, depending on how many senior cadets you have, senior members available. Those are kind of determining factors on how you might do your feedback. Again, there is no right or wrong way of doing the feedback, but from my experience, doing feedback all at one time does not establish a culture of providing feedback. It says that we just do feedback at specific times, and we'll just do feedback then. So do what you will with that information, but I thought that my experience with the second large squadron was different from all my other experiences because of the senior members being so hands-on in comparison to the previous ones. And there are pros and cons to that, because the senior members were really dedicated. They really cared about what the cadets were doing, and they wanted to ensure the success of the meeting. And on the flip side of that, when I was in the smaller unit, I felt ownership and I felt empowered that whatever happens during the meeting, I'm responsible, and I'm going to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible and take actions myself in order to ensure things are going well. So like taking initiative was a skill that I learned because of leading a small unit. And like looking at my watch and being like, okay, it is currently 6:45 and we need to get on that. We need to move on to the next block. And so it was challenging with the larger unit because we just had so many people. You have to move so many people from one room to another, and it takes time. And so with that larger unit, we were able to provide positive experiences to those new cadets, especially those participating in Great Start, because of how organized and focused that energy was. But then when the cadets got into the larger group, if they didn't take initiative, if they didn't apply for leadership positions, the retention rates were a little bit lower because they didn't feel like they were very involved with the program. They didn't feel like they were as individually important, potentially. And every month was about the same in terms of what they should expect. And as a senior cadet, I didn't necessarily feel as engaged with that larger unit because I just felt like I was just one of many, and that individual consideration wasn't there like when I was in the two smaller units. So overall, there is no right or wrong way to run a squadron. That is the bottom line here. However the squadron is being run, as long as people are being cared for, as long as you are meeting the contact hours for the cadets, as long as everyone is being safe, having fun, and getting something positive out of their experiences, then you're winning. And you can also see that based off of the recruitment and retention of your members. Like if there are lots of senior cadets who aren't staying, and they might be transferring out, or they are just leaving the program, then a good question would be to ask, why is that happening? Maybe reach out to those senior cadets and say, hey, is there a specific reason why you are not considering renewing your membership? That cadet may be honest, and they might just say, I'm not feeling CAP anymore and I would just like to leave. So let's say I'm creating the perfect squadron. Here is what I would do, and then you can take whatever you'd like from that and try to apply it to your own unit, or you could always give me feedback and say, hey, but what about this? And I would love to hear your thoughts. So the first thing that I would start out with is looking at the mission, vision, command intent, and strategic plan. That's something that I firmly believe is what sets a team up for success. And so strategic plan-wise, I would look at the national one. I would look at anything sent out by region, and there's normally one sent out by wing every year. And it's the strategic plan that lists out 5 years of objectives that Civil Air Patrol as a whole wants to accomplish. I would look at what can the squadron currently address, and what do I want it to definitely address within the next 5 years. So as an example, if I know that I currently don't have any members on my roster that are doing SUAS, then I would potentially seek out additional senior members throughout the group or wing to see if they would be able to train members in the unit, and bring in someone who might be a drone pilot, see if they can bring their experience and teach other people while also being evaluated on the Civil Air Patrol side. So after looking at the strategic plan, mission, like the current things that we're working towards, vision, what we are looking to build our members into like 5 years from now, and command intent, how we are accomplishing it, I would want to ensure that we are prioritizing safety, fun, and learning to establish a positive culture, and that we're welcoming of all members regardless of their background. After looking at the strategic plan, mission, vision, command intent, and setting that strong foundation, looking at goals of what we want to accomplish. Those are some pretty big things. Then I would look at how are we going to engage the cadets? How are we going to engage the senior members? Assuming that it's a composite squadron, I would want a strong deputy commander for cadets and a strong deputy commander for seniors. the deputy commander for seniors, I might look for experience with the education and training system, just so that they can help with onboarding senior members and making them feel comfortable with logging in into services, and then looking at the modules and access, getting enrolled, and then also being able to evaluate people in level 1, level 2, and maybe even level 3 or level 4, so that when members are progressing, then they can support evaluating. Or if they had experience with finance, that would be very useful to mentor someone into the finance position, because that's one that some squadrons struggle to find. And if they have experience with personnel or admin, that would also be very useful. With the senior members, I would want to ensure that responsibilities are pretty equally distributed and strongly delegating things out. Yes, Civil Air Patrol is a volunteer organization, but we're also professionals, and so working with the different members in the unit, holding them accountable, while also working towards improving the unit. Like, especially if we found someone with operations experience, they could help both the senior members and the cadets by coordinating orientation rides on the cadet side, and then coordinating any training flights for aircrew members. Then on the cadet side, I would have a strong CDC who has experience with the cadet program. Doesn't necessarily have to be prior cadet, but someone who has experience and understands the cadet program, preferably like a senior rating in cadet programs. Tech rating is okay, and just understands the purpose of the cadet program. And what is the purpose of the cadet program, I ask? Well, the purpose of the cadet program is to train cadets to be future leaders of America, and that includes STEM fields. So looking at the training intent, looking at CAP Regulation 60-1, and being creative in finding solutions to address the different weaknesses in the unit, while also bolstering those strengths that we have. Like, if we have a really strong cadet commander, but no other cadets who are really ready for the challenge, looking at how can we mentor the other cadets to be as strong as this cadet? What steps do we take to get that cadet to here? And how might we apply some of those skills to the other cadets? Or are there other techniques that we need to use to engage them because they just have different learning styles? Whatever it may be, trying to approach challenges from different perspectives, also even asking and engaging the cadets in making decisions that will make a lasting impact on the cadet program. And I would also want other senior members in the unit that are willing to support that CDC. So that would be maybe like a strong leadership officer who establishes strong feedback practices, and that's both just informal and formal. So the formal side is using the CAP Form 60-90 series, and then the informal would be like pulling the cadet aside, having like the cadet OIC or the cadet in charge of a team giving feedback to one of their team members after teaching a class. Those kind of opportunities really help positively reinforce, here are the areas that you're doing well, and here's what we can do moving forward to further support your leadership development. Also, a strong aerospace team, like there's those competitions like Cyber Patriot, Stellar Explorers, there's model rocketry competition. There's a lot of great things in STEM, and there are the STEM kits that Civil Air Patrol has. So I would definitely want someone who's strong with internal or within the unit aerospace education, someone who would be looking at external, because something that some units don't do is external community outreach of aerospace education. And that is something that Civil Air Patrol's really been working hard on building, which includes the Aerospace Connections and Education Program, working with aerospace education members who aren't complete members in Civil Air Patrol. They are just able to order STEM kits and use them in their classrooms, which is really cool. Or the Teacher Orientation Flight Program. That's super cool. So I would want someone who could do maybe the internal side as a senior member and do the external side. And then just in general, I would look towards building leadership opportunities as frequently as possible for members. For example, I've seen a couple of things with drill. Sometimes I would see like a group of 40 cadets fall into 2 flights. And so there would be a flight commander and a flight sergeant. And so 4 total cadets would be leading drill for 30 minutes. yes, it is good to have the basics down and being able to fall into a flight, do a flank movement, do a column movement, great. But what about the cadets in the flight? What leadership experience are they getting in the flight? As a senior member, I look at that opportunity as something that we can split off into even smaller groups and tailor the experiences based off of where the cadets are in their development. Like if there's a cadet airman first class versus a group of brand new cadets, I would want that cadet airman first class to understand the drill maneuvers that they're required to know for Achievement 3, but I would also want them to start looking at, how do I lead a flight? Because they're soon going to be a cadet NCO. As soon as they complete their Wright brothers, their drill tests turn into following commands to leading the commands. Something that I've seen in the small units and big units is that sometimes cadets who just finished their Wright brothers, they're getting ready to complete their next achievement and get tech sergeant. They've never led a flight before, and they're expected to pass the drill test. And I'm like, how is that even fair to them? So that's really something that I strongly recommend squadrons look at, especially if you're doing drill and ceremonies, is how can you most effectively split up the cadets so that as many of them as possible are getting an opportunity to lead, while simultaneously creating that strong drill foundation for junior cadets. So yeah, I've had cadet airmen teach a cadet airman how to do flank movements, and then I would have that cadet airman leading me in drill of doing it to the rear. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's never too early to learn how to lead in drill. So that's something I wanted to really put a highlight on, because some units, they just follow a flight of 10 cadets in and they just kind of do their thing. And that's perfectly fine. But think, what benefit does drill have after the cadets have already mastered it? What can you further do to challenge them to just think beyond what they're comfortable with and expand their skills? With the ideal unit that I would have, like the perfect unit I would really work towards strengthening the relationship between the cadet side and the senior member side. So what I would do there is I would actively meet with the cadets and senior members all at the same time, and I would have discussions with them. Like, I would meet individually with the public affairs team, and I would talk to the senior member, talk to the cadets, and I would say, okay, so what is the plan? What are you guys working on? What are you most proud of? Is there anything I can do to support you all? And are there any exciting things coming up ahead? And by meeting with each of those groups, that would give them individual consideration, and it would potentially strengthen the relationship between the cadets and the senior members, because they have to work together to create a plan. If you are in a composite squadron, then you should have senior member counterparts to the cadets. And sometimes you may not, depending on if you have few cadets or a few senior members. But I really do strongly believe that senior members have a lot of experience to share with cadets, and cadets have a lot to teach senior members too sometimes, because they have different life experiences and different strengths. Like, some cadets are whizzes at, I've never used that word before. Some cadets are whizzes at using, like, video editing software, where some senior members may never have touched it before, or have used Windows Movie Maker, which I have used too, but that's not as current in terms of video editing software. So cadets and senior members alike can learn from each other, and I think if both sides are open to learning from each other's experiences and they're respectful, then that can create such a beautiful culture in a squadron. So that's all that I wanted to talk about, I think, in this video. This video has gotten a little long. I might talk more about just specific thoughts on specific practices in units, but I just wanted this video to summarize my experience with a couple different units, my observations, and just general thoughts on the ideal unit that I would put together. And I know that it may not be entirely realistic to be like, wow, I'm going to make the perfect unit and I'll have the perfect number of members. That doesn't always happen, but everyone in CAP is a volunteer, and we're all doing the best that we can to support the organization, our local communities, and everything that we do. So I just want to end this video by saying, whatever unit you may be in, whatever situation your squadron or your flight might be, everyone is trying, and I think you are doing a most excellent job, and I hope you keep it up, because you have made it to the end of this video in addition to caring about your squadron. So thank you so much for watching, and again, if you got thoughts, just let me know in the comments. But that is all, folks. Until next time. Toodles.